You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to a special edition of the Today's Conveyancer podcast, where I'm talking to James Munro. James is the head of the National Trading Standards Estate and Letting Agents team. I have to make sure that I say that acronym correctly. And James is responsible ultimately for the material information guidance that has been published in the last week or so, and has had a bit of a mixed review across the industry in terms of the response to it. But I thought it would be really useful to have the man himself discuss what the guidance actually says, what's intended, and talk us through the potential benefits for conveyancers. So, James, thank you very much indeed for joining the podcast.
You're welcome.
I hope that's a good enough intro, but in the first instance, perhaps you might tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at the Trading Standards team.
Thanks, David. I'm a trading standards officer by profession. I've been in the industry in the profession for around 35 years, and I've been head of the team that's been regulating estate agency work across the UK for almost the last 10 years. And we took over the lead enforcement authority role for the Tenant Fees Act and relevant lettings legislation in 2019. So that's the background to what we do. Our main regulatory role is involved with estate and letting agents, but obviously there are a lot of key players in that particular industry, associated professionals such as conveyancers and conveyancing lawyers. So I think the work that we do is always going to have some kind of impact on those other associated professions. But we're there to oversee the regulation of the industry, support local authorities in their day-to-day regulation, and also one of our roles is to provide advice and guidance on the legislation as it applies to property agents.
Well, at the risk of teaching grandmother to suck eggs, I thought it'd be worthwhile just at the outset to go through that final piece of the jigsaw that you've described, which is the material information guidance, the regulation it relates to, and why this guidance has been produced now. So the backstory here is that the consumer protection regulations were introduced in about 2014 from memory.
They were introduced in 2008. So this is the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations, or as we sometimes refer to them as the CPRs.
And they superseded the Properties Misdescriptions Act and apply to buying televisions as much as buying houses. So it's made the actual detail of the implementation quite tricky.
Yes, that's right. I think the Property Misdescriptions Act applied to estate agents and property developers, and that was introduced in the early 90s. The flaw, if you like, with that piece of legislation was, whilst it helpfully had a list of all the things that were considered at that time to be material to a property in the schedule to the Act, it only required that agents were truthful and honest about things that they actually disclosed. And of course, if you didn't disclose anything, then you wouldn't get into trouble with any particular misdescriptions. So it was recognised that when the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations came in 2008, these actually, interestingly, replaced the Trade Descriptions Act, which is obviously very well known amongst businesses and the general public. And they apply to all businesses, all business activity across the whole of the UK. And as well as introducing a general duty to trade fairly and act with professional diligence, they also require businesses, quite curiously, not to omit material information when dealing with consumers. They are applicable to all UK businesses, but we think that property agents have a particularly challenging job when marketing property, because property comes with all sorts of issues and things that affect it, which could be material for the average consumer when looking for their home.
So the CPRs govern the information that an average consumer would want or need to know in order to make an informed decision about a purchase. As you say, the application to property is quite complex because what might be important or material to one person won't be to another. So we are talking about the release of these parts B and C of the guidance that has been produced by the training standards team. They follow part A. Can you just give us a bit of a quick plotted history of part A, B, and C and what you are looking to achieve with those three components of this guidance?
Well, for years, we've been trying to help property agents to comply with not just the Estate Agents Act and the lettings legislation, but also with the consumer protection regulations as they apply to the marketing of property. And because the regulations aren't prescriptive, in other words, they don't list the information that is relevant to a particular transaction. As you say, it's very complex when it comes to property, because also the other factor is that property transactions by their very nature tend to take quite a long time. And the regulations apply at the outset and also during the process and after any contract has been made. So that's why it's particularly important and challenging for property agents. So agents for years have been asking, what do we need to do? Tell us what we need to disclose when it comes to marketing properties. So a few years ago, we got together a steering group of some of the major stakeholders in the property industry, and we set the steering group the task of coming up with a list of what is considered to be material information in relation to property transactions. We split this into three purely to try to make it a staged process and make it easier to actually understand the different parts of it. Part A was fairly straightforward because this was non-optional financial information relating to property. So this is information that is going to have a direct financial impact on a potential purchaser. And that consisted of quite clearly the asking price for the property, which has never been an issue. That's normally always been displayed on a property. The tenure of the property, which certainly for England and Wales anyway, at least it's that distinction between freehold and leasehold. There are obviously other types of property tenure as well, but the main ones are freehold and leasehold. Well, if a property is freehold, then that's generally there are no issues with that. But obviously with leasehold, you have ground rent, service charges, the length of the lease, the review periods on these ground rent and service charges, all of which carry a material financial impact on people should they choose to go ahead with the purchase of that property. And then lastly, you had the council tax band, which is an indication of the amount of council tax that would be payable on that property, which also is important because you pay council tax on a property whether you live in or not. Mm-hmm. Quite often you'll pay more if you don't live in it. So that's relevant. That's all in the part A of the guidance. That was released early last year. And then we embarked on the next two parts, which as we went forward with this, we came to the conclusion that they would be better released together, which partly explains why it's taken so long in between part A and the recent release of parts B and C. But essentially part B is information about the property itself, so the type of property, the construction, the supplies, the electricity, water, sewerage details, and information also about things like mobile and broadband coverage. It's important at this stage just to allay some of the fears that people or some of the criticism that people have come out with, and that we're trying here to come up with a process that also enables agents to put this information onto their CRM systems and then ultimately to go onto either their websites or social media, for example, or predominantly onto the property portals. Now, whilst some of this information may not actually be material, it's just the way these things have developed in that, for example, the construction of a property, if a property is a traditional brick built, it has mains electricity, it has mains water, it has mains sewerage, it has full broadband and mobile availability of the property, that in itself is not particularly material. What we're actually looking for here are things that are going to directly affect the average consumer's transactional decision. And the test there, I suppose, is by saying, if at some point some information comes out later down the line and a person said, well, had I known that earlier on, I would never have rung the agent, emailed, set up a viewing, commissioned a survey or whatever, then that, generally speaking, is something that is going to be material to that person. So we then moved on after that to part C, which are things that affect the property. And this could be anything from the sort of building safety issues to restrictions, covenants and rights, easements, rights of way across the property, flood risk, and then any planning, permission or building control issues, outstanding issues, and also things relating to accessibility and adaptations, and then particularly the issue around coal mining and where that can impact on properties as well.
And all of this information is required, at the point of listing or at the point at which a purchaser is interested in finding out more? Because there is a sort of slight difference in that period.
There is. The regulations require that information that is material to the average consumer should not be omitted at any stage, and so that starts at the outset from when the property is listed, whether that's listing on a website, social media, or in a property agent's window, or indeed on a property portal listing. Now, this is where some of the perceived challenges come in, and the people are wondering about how this impacts on things like the role of the conveyancer, for example, and property agents being property agents. They're not conveyancers, they're not surveyors, and we're not asking agents to become conveyancers or surveyors. Their job is to find out material information, material facts about a property. It's not their job to interpret things or try to work out things that would be within the specialism of a conveyancer or a surveyor. So it's about sourcing the facts that are available about that property and putting that in the property listing, so that potential buyers in this instance, are better informed. And the ultimate result is that it will reduce unnecessary inquiries. It will hopefully speed up transaction times, reduce transaction fall through, and also reduce the number of complaints that are made to the redress schemes where information is found out at a later stage, which has resulted in a financial commitment for potential buyers or a waste of time in making inquiries. And also, let's not forget when you're buying a property, it's an emotional as well as a financial commitment, and so the need to have that information at the outset is there to enable people to make that informed decision without committing or going down the road any further.
You've kind of alluded to it in what you said there, but who ultimately is responsible for providing this information then, in your view?
Agents are responsible for providing the information. There are various means by which and various sources from which this information can be obtained. And clearly, with some properties, there will be very little that is material, because if there are no building safety issues or restrictions or rights or any flooding risks or any outstanding planning permission, building regulations, anything like that, then that's going to be fairly straightforward. But indeed, on the other side, that is useful information for people to have anyway. We're not requiring that people populate property listings with information that is not material, but as I said before, it's one of those outcomes of this, that it will be there in the property listing, and we think it's going to be useful for people to know about in any case. But our main drive is about disclosing material information that is going to affect somebody's decision.
And herein is the opportunity for conveyancers, because the guidance very directly says you should get a property lawyer or a conveyancer involved as an earlier part of the transaction, because, as you've said, if there's an easement or there are access issues that need to be disclosed at the outset, the agent isn't qualified to understand the implications of that, or even necessarily to know how to establish that information.
Yeah, that's quite right. And I think the Part A and Part B information is factual information, and that should be relatively easy, if not obvious, to establish. The Part C is where you get the crossover, if you like, with the conveyancing side of things. And I guess the message in practice is where agents are going out to do a market appraisal, then they need to be looking for things that will raise a flag, if you like, for these particular issues in Part C. A lot of the information around restrictions and rights and easements is available on the land registry documentation in England and Wales, and similar records in Scotland, in the Register of Scotland, and in Northern Ireland as well. The flood risk is available online, and the planning permission and building regulations issues. The land registry are currently building the capacity to have that. That's going to be coming across the country very soon. So it's about looking at those particular issues, and if there are those things there. So for example, if an agent goes and does a market appraisal and they've noted that there are restricted covenants, that there are easements on the property, that there's a potential high risk of flooding, there are outstanding planning and permission and building regulations issues, these are things that need to be raised with the vendor to say these are things that are going to be disclosed. Now, if they are just factual information, so for example, if an easement, for example, is just that somebody has a right of way across the garden in the corner, or there's a footpath running across land, for example, then that is just a factual issue. Sometimes covenants can be quite complicated. They can be quite straightforward, but they can be quite complicated. So where the message really is that agents need to be saying to vendors, get a conveyancer involved. This information is going to have to come out, and it's better that we resolve it and display it and communicate it in a meaningful way now when the property is listed, rather than people having to find this out at a later stage when they might be financially and emotionally invested in that particular property and won't be in the position to make a proper decision because they will be so invested in the property. Whereas if they knew that at the outset, then they could make a really informed decision at that point without having to waste any more time. So this is the real message when it comes to the involvement of conveyancers, is where those flags, if you like, about potential issues or the interpretation of those issues come about at that market appraisal stage. That's the point at which vendors need to be seeking the advice of a conveyancer. Now, clearly, this raises all sorts of issues around the capacity of conveyancers and the business models of a lot of conveyancers, because I know that a lot of conveyancers, their standard message is to wait until an offer's been accepted, at which point they'll get involved and they will charge a set fee for their services. It's something we've been in discussion with conveyancing bodies and associations about, and it's one of those things where I think that there needs to be a change in the way that possibly conveyancers offer their services, so that they are able to offer this possibly limited service to the vendor at the time, to go through these issues, interpret the issues properly, and come up with some kind of pragmatic and informative way to disclose that information that may be a little bit complex or a little bit detailed, that the agent wouldn't be in a professional position to be able to disclose, to display in that form.
So my understanding is that the guidance falls short of saying you need a draft contract, but what I'm reading between the lines here, James, is that this is a great opportunity for the conveyancing profession to get their teeth into, for want of a better phrase, a transaction at a much earlier stage and actually add a lot of value to that relationship quite early on.
I think so. I think that's a fair assessment of it. Clearly, it's up to agents and conveyancers as to how they conduct their business, the business model. But I would hope that there are conveyancers out there that would see this as an opportunity and be able to market their services such that they are able to offer this limited upfront package, if you like, or service to go through this, and then potentially with a caveat to get involved afterwards if the property goes through. I don't know. That's obviously up to them and their business model to do. But that's the kind of thing that we're hoping that will come out of this, and we're hoping that conveyancers and agents can work together so that this information can be sourced, interpreted, and displayed to the buying public at an early stage.
There are knocking on for 1 million transactions each year, give or take. That's an awful lot of work for you and your team. I know you work with the portals as well, Rightmove, Zoopla on the market. But how is this going to be policed? How are we going to make sure that this information is made available to consumers at the right point in time, and the property lawyer has got the opportunity to get involved? Because, of course, if this information isn't being produced and it isn't being passed on to consumers, that opportunity isn't going to exist.
Yeah, you're right. It's there's a number of different angles to this when it comes to ensuring compliance with this. At the outset, I'll just say that this is guidance for agents. So it's the enforcement of these regulations is within the remit of local trading standards authorities. We can also enforce it as well on a national basis, but it's ultimately down to local trading standards. They will be dealing with the most serious breaches, because it is legislation that ultimately could end up at its very most serious with a fine or a prison sentence. But the vast majority of issues with non-compliance of this guidance will end up with the redress schemes. We're working with the redress schemes. They were on the steering group, and we're also going to be conducting a campaign of education for consumers, for the buying public out there as well. Also, when agents are listing properties on a property portal, the fields that are displayed will mirror many of these requirements, or many of the points listed in the parts A, B, and C. If an agent doesn't complete the field or doesn't put in any information for those fields, it's going to flag as a ask agent or similar kind of. There will be a flag on that particular field. We think that this is going to point out to people that there is information missing, and I would hope that agents would want to make sure that their property listings are as comprehensive as possible. And so there is an element of monitoring compliance through the property portals, through their data fields. We work very closely with the redress schemes. We approve the redress schemes in the property sector, the 2 redress schemes, so we can monitor complaints, we can monitor trends, and we have a referral mechanism in place with the redress schemes for serious cases. There's also the Citizens Advice Consumer Service, so Citizens Advice provide advice to consumers, and we have a plug into that data feed so that we can monitor any complaints coming through there. But ultimately, it's a multi-handed approach, but primarily the redress schemes are going to be they're going to be the ones that are going to be dealing with the bulk of the complaints. But we hope that agents will see this as an opportunity, and likewise the conveyancers. We think that this is an opportunity for agents to show their professionalism, to demonstrate that they are able to provide comprehensive property listings, which will help the buying public, and as I say, which will improve the transaction times and reduce the number of transaction fall throughs. And ultimately, no agent wants to have to deal with a complaint that goes to a redress scheme, because it's time and money. Even if the complaint is unjustified, or if they find in favour of the agent, it's still a waste of time and money. So invest that time and money in getting it right in the first place, and the benefits will pay for themselves.
We're only just a week out from the announcements, but certainly today's Conveyancer has heard some interesting comments around the implications of parts B and C. Have you had any feedback about the implementation so far?
Well, I would say that the reaction so far has been overwhelmingly supportive. don't forget this was a combined effort. It wasn't just us, it was the members of the steering group who are also responsible for their input and the production of this guidance. So there was always support from within the group. It has been well received. There are going to be the odd few negative comments, and I'm hoping that by producing podcasts such as this, by taking part in webinars and other forms of guidance and advice and support for the industry, we are there to ultimately to support legitimate businesses as well as protect consumers. So I think by doing that, we can help to address those particular concerns or criticisms about the process. There are people talking about return to HIPs and all this kind of thing, and I think it's important that we can try to put their minds at rest about the purpose and the scope of this guidance. And it really is trying to help agents to comply with the regulations, which have been enforced for some 15 years now. It's just trying to give them that clarity so that they can comply with that, the regulations, and make the property listing world a better place.
I suspect you're going to be a pretty busy man between now and the first quarter of 2024. But is there anything that you feel that we haven't covered off that is a message that you really want to put out there?
It's really just about trying to reassure the industry, trying to reassure all the associated professions such as conveyancers and lawyers. It's about saying that the aim here is to improve the amount of information, factual information that is available at the outset. And it's trying to dispel some of the myths. It's trying to just educate people to say that, for example, one of the common questions we get around restrictive covenants, for example, people assume that covenants are old and they only apply to old properties, and they're very an outdated concept. But actually, a lot of new build houses come with restrictive covenants. It's still very much in use today. It can stop buyers and tenants, anybody living in the property. It can restrict what they do in the property, or whether they can carry out business from there, for example, or advertise services. All these kind of things that can have a real practical impact on somebody's enjoyment of that property. So I think there's definitely an education need here. There's an education need for the industry, for the property industry, but also for consumers, because I think for too long the home buying and selling process has been almost shrouded with mystery. And I think in this day and age, the digital services give us a unique opportunity to source information either free or at very little cost, and to convey that factual information to people at the outset, so that they can really make that informed decision about what they're looking for without having to go and make further inquiries and view a property and carry out other inquiries, which then result in something which they then say, oh, if I'd have known that before, I would never have got involved in the first place. I'd have just scrolled past.
I think that's a really interesting point, that we're on the cusp of this tech breakthrough in the home move, and certainly the wider availability of this data makes much of what you've talked about today much easier to get to.
It's incumbent on agents and conveyancers to work together on these kind of things. I think there's been this sort of artificial barrier between the two. Conveyancers have traditionally come along very much later in the proceedings. Their job there is ultimately to convey the property. That obviously involves a lot of legal processes and interpretation of issues and making sure that everything is right. But ultimately, it's about trying to get all the other information at an earlier stage, so that people arrive at that conveyancing process equipped with as much information as they can be at that point, so that they're then empowered to carry on with the process.
The thing that strikes me here is that this is, yes, guidance, but it is an opportunity for everything that you've talked about around collaboration. It's a really big opportunity for the industry to come together and make a difference to a process that at the moment has been described to me as broken, but not quite broken enough. It still works. We still move a lot of people every year, but when it takes 6-7 months, you sort of do wonder whether it's the best it can be. So it's been great to have you on the podcast, James, and I really, really appreciate you taking some time out to talk us through the release. Thank you.
You're welcome, David. It's been a pleasure.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to James. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.